The birthplace of the man known to history as Idi Amin in Uganda during the mid-1920s is unknown. Although some accounts, including one from Hussein, Amin's son, place his birth year as late as 1928, it is more likely that he was born in 1923 or 1924. The assertion that Amin was born in Kampala, the capital of the country, is similarly contested. It is more probable that he was born in Kiboko, a Muslim-dominated region in the country's northwestern side, in close proximity to the border with present-day South Sudan. The background of his father is similarly obscure. According to some accounts, Andreas Nyabir belonged to the Kakwa people. In the early 20th century, he converted from Roman Catholicism to Islam and subsequently adopted the name Amin Dada. However, alternative sources posit that his ancestry may have been Nubian and that he might have been brought up as a Muslim. If this is the case, it is likely that his family originated in Sudan and was part of the Sudanese communities that Emin Pasha, a governor of the Ottoman province of Equatoria in the late 19th century who traveled as far south as Uganda in the 1880s, brought south. Similar to Asa at, Amin's mother's lineage is a matter of dispute. It is possible that she belonged to the ethnic groups Kakwa or Lugbara, which inhabited the region that is now northern Uganda. The limited information at his disposal regarding Idi's early life suggests that both he and his mother were abandoned by their father, leaving his mother to raise him alone. Early in the 1940s, during the Second World War raging to the east and north in Italian East Africa and the Maghreb, he attended an Islamic school in Bombo. An analysis of Amin's life must commence with an examination of Uganda's colonial past. Uganda, similar to numerous other regions in sub-Saharan Africa, was a nation that originated primarily from the fantasies of its colonial powers and lacked ethnic or religious consistency. Various civilizations once inhabited the area that is now Uganda. During the pre-colonial era, the Bugandans, who ruled a significant portion of the country in the southern part of modern-day Uganda, including the region surrounding the capital city of Kampala, were the most numerous. However, the region also harbored numerous Nilotic peoples, including the Kakwa and Lugbara, in the north and east, and a sizable Sudanese population in the northwest. Additionally, pockets of Kuliak people inhabit the areas that now comprise the Kenya-eastern Uganda border. In addition, the Ugandan populace was religiously divided, with a sizable Muslim community residing in the northern region, from which Islam had spread southward via Egypt and Sudan, while the remaining population adhered to the indigenous religions of Uganda. Many individuals had also embraced religious affiliations such as Protestantism or Roman Catholicism. This patchwork of rival religions and ethnicities formed the foundation of contemporary Uganda. The Kingdom of Buganda occupied a significant portion of the region during the late 19th century, when British encroachment began. The establishment of the Uganda Protectorate in 1894 was motivated by the British imperialists' desire to acquire control over an uninterrupted territory extending from Cairo, Egypt to Cape Town, South Africa. Certain internal divisions of the country were further intensified during the British colonial era. This was due to the colonial regime's preference for Protestant-affiliated Bugandan elements, which it used as a proxy to govern the country and subjugate the Muslim elements in the north. Although colonial rule was characterized by exploitation, it also yielded positive outcomes, including the establishment of a modern economy and infrastructure, particularly in the cultivation of cash crops like sugar and cotton. During the first half of the 20th century, literacy rates also rose substantially. An additional significant advancement occurred during the early 20th century when the colonial regime initiated the training and arming of indigenous Ugandans, thereby establishing a Ugandan military. This endeavor gained momentum before and during the First World War, as it served as a strategy to challenge the German colonial holdings in East Africa. Subsequent assertions that he had enlisted in the British Army and fought against the Japanese on the Burma front during World War II were largely fabrications that Amin himself fabricated. He rapidly ascended the car. With his athletic prowess and efforts as a soldier, he garnered favor among the British officers and left an indelible mark. As a result, he was expeditiously elevated to a rank within the KAR, surpassing the potential for an individual of African descent at that juncture. Furthermore, by the late 1940s, he had been deployed to the adjacent country of Kenya, where unrest against British colonial rule was more intense than in his native Uganda. Consequently, Amin was present in 1952 when the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, colloquially referred to as the Mau Mau, instigated a protracted insurrection against British domination that persisted throughout the 1950s. Although Amin performed admirably during this campaign in Kenya, he would later attempt to minimize his participation in a conflict whose purpose was to defend British imperial rule. Additionally, in 1952, he was elevated to the rank of corporal, and the following year, to sergeant. During the course of the 1950s, Amin maintained a degree of success. Ian Graham, who later authored a memoir detailing his relationship with Uganda and the future dictator, was Amin's commanding officer in the KAR. Graham later asserted that Amin was among the most exceptional soldiers and mid-ranking officers he had ever under his command. Additional officers concurred with this evaluation. Additionally, he was deployed to Europe for further military training and was stationed in Stirling, Scotland, for a period of time during this period. This marked the inception of an affection for the nation, which Amin, as we shall see, eventually developed into the idea that he might ascend to the throne of Scotland. On his return to Africa in 1959, he was bestowed with the title of Effendi, which translates to Afande in Swahili as Ka. This elevated him to the highest rank an African could attain in the British Armed Forces in East Africa, Class II Warrant Officer. However, there were also indicators that Amin was about to encounter difficulties. The Kenya-Afghanistan Republic, KAR, was summoned to intervene in the extensive cattle raiding that was transpiring along the Uganda-Kenya border in late 1961 and early 1962. Amidst this, Amin issued the order for his platoon to execute countless villages. Due to Uganda's impending independence from Britain and the colonial governor, Sir Frederick Crawford, apprehensive about a scandal involving one of the two native Ugandans serving as commissioned officers in the colonial army, he narrowly evaded court-martial for this act of civil disobedience. During Amin's ascent within the colonial British Army in East Africa, a profound transformation was occurring throughout the African continent. The Western Allies ratified the Atlantic Charter in 1941 in response to United States pressure. The charter stipulated that the colonies of the European powers would be granted greater independence in the post-World War II era. This factor, in conjunction with the failure to maintain their empires in the aftermath of the war, ensured that a significant number of African nations achieved independence during the mid-20th century. In 1945, either Britain or France occupied the southern and western portions of the continent, respectively, and controlled the vast majority of the landmass. Belgium ruled a vast territory in the Congo, Portugal occupied two substantial blocks encircling Mozambique and Angola, and Italy ruled the majority of the Horn of Africa and Libya, all in the central regions. In the immediate post-war period, there was limited progress towards bestowing independence upon these expansive colonies. However, the mounting pressure to do so escalated by the 1950s. Consequently, Morocco and Tunisia achieved their independence from France in 1956, and the subsequent acceleration of this process was rapid. During the year 1960, several African nations achieved independence from France, including Cameroon, Senegal, Togo, Mali, Benin, Niger, the Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Madagascar. Simultaneously, Belgium handed over its colonies and established the Republic of the Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda. Ghana was ceded to the United Kingdom in 1957, and Nigeria was subsequently returned in 1961. East Africa underwent the decolonization process several years subsequent to certain regions of Northwest Africa. The manner in which it originated in Uganda and neighboring regions was also notably distinct from that of nations situated further to the northwest. Political factions comprised of pro-independence indigenous populations, many of whom had received their education in London or Paris before returning to their homelands with a resolute aspiration to attain self-governance, had emerged in several of these other nations. Uganda witnessed intermittent demands for independence during the latter half of the 1950s, with a dearth of substantial political parties and a cohesive political movement. As a consequence, upon the liberation of Uganda on October 9, 1962, and the subsequent establishment of the Republic of Uganda, a nascent political climate hindered the gradual transfer of authority. However, within a short period of time, three significant political parties surfaced: the Democratic Party, which advocated for the Catholic community; the Uganda People's Congress, which primarily represented the Nilotic people residing in the northern region of the country; and the Kabaka Yeka, a nationalist party from Buganda. Uganda's inaugural prime minister was elected in 1962, following a coalition between the People's Congress and Kabaka Yeka to oust the Democratic Party from power. As a result, UPC leader Milton Obote was able to secure the position. Subsequent to his ascension to power in Uganda, Obote dominated Ugandan politics in the 1960s. However, his tenure was beset by many of the same challenges that had beset other African nations in the post-independence era, namely, the difficulty of uniting a country that was an artificial creation of the British and comprised numerous ethnic groups and religions. Consequently, during the mid-1960s, a conflict arose between proponents of a decentralized federal state, one in which the Nilotic people, Bugandans, and other groups primarily governed themselves in their respective provinces, and those who desired a centralized, powerful Ugandan state ruled from the capital, Kampala. The pinnacle of this dispute occurred in February 1966, when Obote overthrew the constitution and seized considerable authority, effectively establishing a dictatorship. Nonetheless, this was not an unusual phenomenon in Africa after independence. During the 1960s, tyrannical dictators such as Joseph Mobutu in the Congo, Jean Bokassa in the Central African Republic, Francisco Marcius Nguema in Equatorial Guinea, and Abubakar Sangole Lamazana in what was formerly the Republic of Upper Volta but is now Burkina Faso, seized power throughout the continent. Uganda was thus conforming to this discouraging pattern at the time of Obote's 1966 coup d'état. Amin benefited from Obote's consolidation of his control over the nation. During the initial years of Uganda's independence, he steadily advanced in rank within the armed forces. Following the Ugandan military's independence in 1962, he was promoted to captain, then major in 1963, and finally deputy commander in 1964. In 1965, at the tender age of 40, Amin was ultimately promoted to the rank of army commander. He attained the highest rank in the Ugandan military in 1970, when he was promoted to general commander of the Ugandan armed forces. A significant portion of his meteoric rise during the 1960s was facilitated by his involvement in Obote's corrupt dealings in Uganda. Kleptocratic states emerged alongside the rise of dictators throughout much of Africa during that time period. In these states, the dictators and their adherents effectively looted the country's resources in order to amass immense personal wealth. During the mid-1960s, Amin provided assistance to Obote in his endeavor to illicitly transport gold and ivory from the Congo to Uganda. While a portion of the revenue generated from this endeavor was intended to support the arming of separatists and rebels in the Congo, the majority of the proceeds were instead pilfered by Obote, Amin, and their accomplices. The revelation of Obote and Amin's illicit trade operations in 1966 played a pivotal role in Obote's determination to seize complete authority in Uganda the same year. Thus, by the late 1960s, Idi Amin had risen to prominence as one of Uganda's most influential figures. As time progressed, Obote's regime grew more authoritarian, especially in the wake of a 1969 failed attempt to assassinate the dictator, which resulted in a nationwide crackdown on political and military dissent. Amin, serving as Obote's enforcer, was instrumental in implementing these measures. In spite of his close ties to Obote, it is now evident that Amin, at the very least, was engaged in a conspiracy during the late 1960s with the intention of seizing power or consolidating his control over the military. He specifically recruited a substantial number of soldiers from the northern Ugandan regions of Kakwa and Nubi, which border the Sudanese border. They belonged to his own ethnic group and were fellow Muslims. Amin strengthened his authority over the Ugandan military by appointing officers and soldiers from this region to its ranks, thereby positioning himself ahead of a potential takeover of power. Furthermore, Amin likely sought the backing of both Israel and Britain in order to execute this maneuver. Britain maintained a significant sway in East Africa and, during the Cold War, was concerned about what it perceived to be Obote's pursuit of socialist policies. Israel, meanwhile, had been active in Uganda since the 1960s and sought to divert the attention of its northern neighbors, Sudan and Egypt, from its ongoing occupation of the Sinai Peninsula through the region and adjacent countries. Amin's schemes ultimately culminated in the early 1970s. Obote, who had grown suspicious of Amin's motives by that time, dismissed the general from his position of overall command of the Ugandan military in October 1970 and appointed himself to that position. His subsequent attempt to compile charges of financial misconduct against Amin was belated and ultimately proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Amin, having become aware of Obote's intentions during the intervening period, retaliated violently against the president. Amin staged a military coup on January 25, 1971, during Obote's absence at a Commonwealth Nations conference in Singapore. Promptly secured with the capital city of Kampala and key communication outlets, including radio stations. As a result, Amin was capable of apprising the populace of his coup against the corrupt Obote well in advance of the president's response, which would have taken place several thousand kilometers away. Amin advocated for the reinstatement of the constitution. He asserted that his tenure in office would be limited to a few weeks or months as the democratically elected government returned. Obote would return to Africa, specifically to Tanzania, a neighboring country, where he was exiled for the 1970s. 8 years later, Amin established one of the most brutal dictatorships in Africa. Amin expeditiously solidified his authority over Uganda in the weeks that ensued after the largely non-violent coup in January 1971. He proclaimed himself the new president of Uganda and reappointed himself as the supreme commander of the Ugandan Armed Forces on February 2. Rapidly transforming into a military dictatorship, the new regime made no pretense of respecting the old constitution or legal system. Such pretenses were purely symbolic. The court system was predominantly substituted with military tribunals, and Amin's adherents were appointed to a variety of senior political offices and civil jurisdictions without adequate preparation. From that point forward, Amin ruled by decree, and he altered the name of the government headquarters in Kampala to the Command Post. Then, in an effort to strengthen his control over the military and civilian governments, he conducted widespread purges of both, removing thousands of individuals from their positions and replacing them with devoted supporters of Amin and his military government. Indeed, these individuals were frequently not merely demoted from their positions, but executed by the regime, marking the onset of the widespread violence that defined the Amin regime in Uganda during the 1970s. The assumption of power by Amin encountered some degree of opposition. As we have seen, in 1971, Milton Obote sought refuge in Tanzania, the larger and more prosperous southern neighbor of Uganda. In this context, Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, extended his support to Obote while refraining from formally endorsing Amin's regime in Uganda. Furthermore, over the course of the subsequent weeks and months, up to 20,000 Ugandans sought political asylum in Tanzania by fleeing southward. Collaborating to devise a strategy to depose Amin, they rapidly organized into military-trained guerrilla fighter bands. A young Yoweri Museveni, who would later assume a pivotal role in Ugandan politics, was among these forces. In September 1972, finally, components of these Ugandan exiles initiated hostilities. Approximately 1,500 fighters comprised a strike force that traversed the northern border into Uganda in an attempt to stage a coup reminiscent of the one that Amin led the year before. Entebbe Airport, located outside of Kampala, would be apprehended, followed by the security of the capital and the major radio stations to ensure that the nation could be informed of the coup. Nevertheless, these strategies failed to materialize. The invasion was a complete failure that Amin, who had foreseen it, swiftly quelled. It ended within days and claimed the lives of hundreds of invaders, but it was a significant precursor to the role Tanzania would play in subsequent events. During the initial years of Amin's regime, the international community reacted positively towards it. The British and Israelis, having supported the 1971 coup, recognized Amin's regime as soon as he ascended to power in the belief that the former Car officer would be less difficult to deal with than Obote. Furthermore, Amin delighted in fostering their irrational beliefs, initially positioning himself as a mediator who could reconcile the political, ethnic, and religious divisions of Uganda, as well as unite the country's diverse religious and ethnic communities. As a result, Amin was greeted warmly during state visits to Israel and Britain in July 1971. He met with British Prime Minister Edward Heath and dined at Buckingham Palace while in the country. Furthermore, he utilised the state visit as an opportunity to revisit Scotland, his former training ground from the 1950s. Particularly fond of Scotland, Amin bestowed Scottish names on several of his sons and attired an entire regiment of the Ugandan army in Scottish kilts. Subsequently, during the mid-1970s, he entertained an odd alliance with the Scottish paramilitary organisation, which ultimately led to his proposition of ascending to the throne of Scotland. Amin requested additional weapons in both London and Tel Aviv with the intention of advancing the conflict to Tanzania. However, both governments denied his request. Curiously, neither the Israeli or British governments appeared to have developed a comprehensive understanding of the person with whom they were dealing during Amin's sojourn in their respective capitals during the summer of 1971. However, these governments quickly developed suspicions regarding his true character, which quickly transformed into regret. In July 1971, during Amin's visit to Buckingham Palace and reacquainting himself with Scotland, two Americans visited the Imbarara Army Barracks in Uganda, a journalist named Nicholas Stroh and a sociology lecturer named Robert Seidel. These Americans were in Uganda to investigate early political killings associated with Amin's regime. They were advised against entering the area, but disregarded the cautions. This proved to be a fatal error. Murder struck both individuals at the barracks. An investigation was promptly initiated in response to the situation in the United States, to which an American legal official named David Jeffries Jones was appointed. Jones expeditiously ascertained that the duo had perished at the hands of Amin's men. However, he fled the nation for his life prior to the conclusion of the investigation. The assassinations of Stroh and Seidel served as the initial substantial proof that Amin in Uganda would not operate as the dependable strongman that the West had anticipated. Further indications of Amin's potential for trouble quickly became apparent. Following the governments of London and Tel Aviv's rejection of Amin's request for additional arms and modern weaponry, he proceeded to approach Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, the de facto dictator of Libya. Subsequent to his coup d'état in 1969, Gaddafi solidified his opposition to the former colonial powers by expelling a substantial portion of the Italian colonial community, seizing strategic Western military bases during the Cold War, and implementing Islamic Sharia law. Therefore, the fact that Amin desired an alliance with the Libyan ruler was extremely ominous. And in order to gain Gaddafi's military support, Amin presented a fantastical view of himself and his native country during his visit to Libya. As an illustration, Amin portrayed himself as an ardent adherent of the Islamic faith and seemingly persuaded Gaddafi that up to 70% of the populace of Uganda belonged to the Muslim faith, when in reality the proportion was no more than 6%, concentrated primarily in the country's northwest adjacent to Sudan. However, Gaddafi was persuaded by Amin's assertions, and the Ugandan facilitated Gaddafi's country's accession to the Organization of Islamic States in exchange for arms and a pledge to restrict the religious freedoms of Christians in Uganda. In 1972, the level of violence initiated by the Amin regime escalated in Uganda. It was specifically directed at the ethnic groups Akoli and Lango, which opposed Amin's regime. As of early 1972, a minimum of 5,000 individuals, comprising soldiers, lawyers, students, religious leaders, and local political figures, had vanished. Frequently, floating remains were discovered in the Nile River. However, the international media were largely ignorant of the situation at this time. However, one event that garnered significant public interest occurred in Mutakula, close to the Tanzanian border, in January 1972. Despite the fact that this incident had spilled over into Tanzania, it had only been extensively reported. However, despite the fact that Western media outlets and foreign services of other nations were largely unaware of the situation in Uganda at the time, the violence continued to escalate. Determining precise figures regarding the death toll and displacements during Amin's dictatorship is a notoriously challenging task. However, by the summer of 1972, tens of thousands of people had been displaced or forced to flee into exile in Tanzania or another country, amidst a steady increase in political and religious persecution. Things continued to deteriorate in the years that followed. The incident that initially garnered international media attention away from Amin's regime occurred during the autumn of 1972 and pertained to the substantial ethnic Asian population of the country. Indian and South Asian colonization in East Africa was an ancient phenomenon, dating back to the 12th century at the latest. It increased dramatically with the advent of the first age of globalization in the latter half of the 19th century. By the end of World War II in 1945, East Africa was home to well over 500,000 Asians, the majority of whom were from India. However, it was not sufficient that regions such as Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Mozambique were home to sizable Asian populations. The expansion of Asians into East Africa was also considered to have an excessively significant impact on the economies of these areas. By the mid-20th century, Asians had seized a position of dominance in the region's commercial and industrial activity. The Asian community in Uganda controlled 80 to 90% of the country's commercial and industrial transactions. As an illustration, 183 cotton ginneries or factories in Uganda were operated by individuals of Indian descent in 1948, according to records. Furthermore, this was reflected in the country's currency. The values of the East Africa shilling banknotes, which were utilized by the British colonial government in the region from 1921 to 1969, were also printed in Arabic and English, in addition to Gujarati. Amin became determined shortly after assuming power to expelling a significant portion of the Asian population from Uganda and to seize control of the country's commercial and industrial sectors for ethnic Ugandans. Therefore, on August 4, 1972, he issued an order mandating the departure of individuals of Asian descent in Uganda who lacked complete Ugandan citizenship within a period of 90 days. This situation presented a dilemma for the British government, as it had made a commitment during independence to grant British citizenship to Asians residing in the region, should they wish to do so. Therefore, Britain emerged as a logical destination for a significant portion of the tens of thousands of non-citizen Asians residing in Uganda who were compelled to depart the nation. However, substantial segments of the British political establishment harbored apprehensions regarding the possible influx of tens of thousands of Ugandan refugees into the country. The London government of Edward Heath endeavoured to dissuade Amin from his intended course of action and postponed the expulsion order as a consequence. Panic entered the air as the November 1972 deadline approached. At the 11th hour, an emergency airlift from the United Nations was ultimately necessary to transport 27,000 Ugandan refugees of Asian descent to Britain. The intentions of Amin in issuing the expulsion order were evident prior to the forced departure of tens of thousands of individuals from the country. During their journey to the airports and borders, individuals who were forcibly exiled were typically deprived of any valuable possessions. Those who voiced dissenting opinions within the nation, including the Chief Justice, Benedicto Kiwanuka, encountered severe consequences. Kiwanuka emerged as a pivotal figure during Uganda's period of transitioning towards independence. He had held a transient position as the technocratic Prime Minister of Uganda during the early 1960s, subsequent to the country's ratification of the right of self-governance and prior to the elections that installed Obote in power. He was released from prison by Amin upon assuming power in 1971, subsequent to his imprisonment by Obote's government in 1969. He initially attempted to cooperate with the new regime and was appointed Chief Justice of the nation. September 1972, however, saw his arrest for his criticism of Amin regarding the treatment of the Asian community and other matters. He was executed by Amin's forces at Makindye military prison on September 22. The execution method employed serves as an indication of Amin's ruthlessness. Following the amputation of Kiwanuka's nose, lips, and ears, he was castrated, defiled, and set on fire. An additional noteworthy consequence of the expulsion of the Asian community in 1972 was the subsequent economic collapse in Uganda, which persisted for months and years. The expulsion of 50,000 to 60,000 Asian Ugandans had resulted in their substantial influence over the nation's commerce and industry. These enterprises were presently transferred to Amin's military adherents. Nevertheless, these were frequently individuals who lacked the rudimentary literacy and numeracy skills required to engage in commerce and had no idea how to operate the businesses they were entrusted with. Utilized for crop production, agricultural machinery eventually malfunctioned and could not be repaired. Cotton gins that jammed or ceased to function were never again utilized. And perhaps the most ironic indication of the economy's complete mismanagement was the cement factory collapses at Tororo and Fort Portal. The Ugandan economy consequently experienced a severe downturn during the mid-1970s. The subsequent consequence was a surge in prices due to shortages of various goods that these companies had manufactured or imported. Amidst a consistent increase in inflation, the Ugandan economy approached a state of near collapse during Amin's reign in 1975 and 1976. In the years that followed the expulsion of the Asian community from Uganda, Amin adopted a more confrontational stance on the international platform. As of late 1972, the majority of British citizens had departed from the nation. In early 1974, Amin effectively estranged London by dismissing 14 members of the British High Commission, an institution established in Kampala subsequent to the Declaration of Independence in 1962. The British High Commission had functioned as a post-colonial oversight committee. In addition to the escalating sanctions imposed by Western nations on Amin's regime, a peculiar circumstance emerged whereby aircraft frequently departed from Stansted Airport in London with cargoes containing high-end European merchandise intended for Amin and other high-ranking members of his regime. The "whiskey run" functioned independently of any trade sanctions that were intended to be imposed on Amin and his adherents. Concurrently, Amin turned to Libya and the Soviet Union for assistance on an increasing scale, denouncing continued Western support for the apartheid regime in South Africa and Israel, a former ally whom he had strained due to its participation in the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. The pinnacle of this diplomatic rift with Western powers was reached in 1975, when Amin's regime graciously hosted the Organization of African Unity Summit in Kampala, where he also presided over the proceedings as its chairman. During this time, he publicly humiliated British Foreign Secretary James Callaghan, who had come to the summit to intercede with Amin on behalf of the British author Dennis Hills, who had referred to Amin as a village tyrant. In a recent book titled The White Pumpkin, Amin effectively coerced several Britons into carrying him into a reception at the summit. Callaghan departed with the conviction that all prospects for collaboration with Amin had vanished. However, the Ugandan government spared Hills, who had been sentenced to death prior to Callaghan's intervention. Simultaneously, Amin strengthened his ties with the Soviet Union. Moscow had provided the regime with military and economic assistance totaling tens of millions of dollars by the end of 1975. Additionally, Amin had deployed a number of thousand Ugandan troops to Eastern Europe for training in modern warfare. Furthermore, the Soviet government sought to establish diplomatic relations with Amin in order to counterbalance the perceived Chinese influence in Tanzania and the British influence in Kenya from a geographical standpoint. Furthermore, it was during the mid-1970s that Amin established ties with a Scottish paramilitary organisation that has since been the subject of books and even a film. Amin was contacted at this time by the Scottish National Liberation Army, an emerging fringe paramilitary organisation based in Scotland that had initiated a low-level terrorist campaign in their native land through the mailing of letter bombs. It was evident that the NSA had heard of Amin's affection for Scotland. Amin demonstrated some understanding for their aspiration for independence from Britain by extending an offer to assume the throne of Scotland in the event that they required his assistance. Should they require his assistance, he would become the first ruler of Scotland to rule independently from Britain in nearly 4 centuries. Although this peculiar proposition served as an intriguing reflection of Amin's progressively irrational disposition, it hardly constituted more than an afterthought during his reign as dictator of Uganda, notwithstanding its subsequent notoriety due to a book and film starring Forrest Whitaker and James McAvoy. During the mid-1970s, while all of this transpired internationally, the regime maintained its brutal practices within its borders. Amin and his adherents openly supported certain ethnic and religious groups in Uganda while engaging in persecution of others. The Kakwas and Nubis, the dictator's own ethnic groups, were given preference in the northern regions. Similarly, the Bagandans, who inhabited the southern area close to Lake Victoria and Kampala, were also courted. A similar treatment was extended to the small Muslim minority, who, despite sharing a religion with Amin, were accorded significant favoritism. Muslims, who comprised less than 6% of the population, held more than 80% of the highest-ranking positions in the military and government by the second half of the 1970s. Nevertheless, certain religious and ethnic communities persisted in being effectively persecuted by the state, including the Akoli and Langi residing in the northeastern and eastern regions of the nation. Tens of thousands of individuals from these social classes continued to be executed, demoted, attacked, imprisoned, or evicted from their lands and residences during the mid-1970s. Furthermore, in order to attain this degree of subjugation, Amin further augmented the Ugandan army, which was already considerable in scale, transforming it into a military aristocracy comprised of his supporters who ruled the nation. The facilitation of Amin's oppression was the State Research Bureau, a clandestine police organization that was established in close proximity to his assumption of power. However, its body of work has been predominantly linked to Robert or Bob Assals since the mid-1970s. British soldier and official Assals, who had fought in the Second World War before entering service in Africa, was a relic of the colonial era. Subsequent to attaining independence in Uganda in 1949, he spent the subsequent 13 years there, where he made the decision to remain and began working for Obote's government. Despite a brief period of imprisonment subsequent to Amin's coup d'état in 1971, he managed to gain the dictator's favor and was promoted to the position of State Research Bureau Director in the mid-1970s. The bureau, led by Assals, was tasked with exposing conspiracies against Amin and the regime, in addition to being accountable for the disappearance of thousands of individuals who were suspected of committing diverse offenses. It was a frequent occurrence in the thoroughfares of Kampala and other Ugandan cities during this period to observe people being forcibly placed in the trunks of vehicles and driven away, frequently with no trace. Amin appears to have placed his trust in Assals, as he progressively deteriorated into irrationality and paranoia during the mid-1970s, perceiving him as one of the few individuals who did not harbor intentions to depose him. Amin's lifestyle and behavior evolved throughout the 1970s as he grew more capricious. The Dictator entered into matrimonial unions with a minimum of 6 women during the 1960s and 1970s. 2 of the 3 divorcees passed away in the months that followed under mysterious circumstances after his 1974 divorce. Then, in the summer of 1975, he exchanged matrimonial vows with Sarah Kayolaba, a 19-year-old go-go dancer, in a lavish ceremony worth £2 million. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian people, served as his best man. He may have fathered a great number of children, possibly as many as 50, via his extensive network of concubines. A considerable number of these were raised in the palaces and mansions that Amin amassed in an expanding fashion throughout the nation. Simultaneously, Amin, an individual with a prodigious drive for sports during his youth, experienced a physical enlargement as he entered his 50s. Conspiracy theories were launched against him, which was a reasonable enough apprehension for a person in his position. However, this frequently escalated into outbursts of complete insanity. Following Amin's out-of-control behavior, Bob Assels later recounted being contacted by government officials who believed he had moderated his behavior. An apparent significant determinant influencing his persona and conduct during his reign as ruler of Uganda was the fact that he had contracted tertiary syphilis in his youth and may have been afflicted with partial dementia by the 1970s. This may have provided an explanation for some of his more peculiar conduct and the allegations of cannibalism that surfaced during the final days of his dictatorship. During the late 1970s, an Israeli physician who had previously completed a medical assignment in Uganda stated openly, "It is not a secret that Amin has developed brain damage due to the advanced stages of syphilis." This may also explain a telegram that Amin at the time sent to the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Kurt Waldheim, in which he lauded the actions of Adolf Hitler, the Nazi dictator of Germany, and appeared to imply that the Holocaust was perpetrated through the use of gas to ignite individuals. Rapid dissemination of the message to world leaders followed, and it subsequently became more evident that Africa was dealing with a partial lunatic. In the interim, Amin's laudation of German actions during the Second World War harmed his relations with the Soviet Union, one of his last remaining military and economic allies. All of this was exacerbated in 1976 by one of the most notorious occurrences linked to Amin and his regime. That summer, on June 27, an Air France aircraft en route from Tel Aviv to Paris via Athens was hijacked. The aircraft was rerouted to Entebbe Airport, located outside of Kampala. It quickly became apparent to the international media that Amin was collaborating with the Revolutionäre Zellen, a West German urban guerrilla organization comprised of Palestinian terrorists, to carry out the hijacking. The non-Jewish passengers were subsequently freed from the aircraft, and it was demanded that dozens of Palestinian political prisoners held in Israel be released immediately. Otherwise, the kidnappers threatened to execute the Jewish hostages on July 1. In contrast, an extraordinary rescue operation ensued when Israeli commandos departed from Israel for Uganda, stopping for refueling in Nairobi, adjacent Kenya, in order to liberate the hostages. The Israeli contractors had constructed the Entebbe airport years prior, so they were familiar with its precise layout. As a result, around 100 Israeli commandos executed a surprise landing on the evening of July 4. They succeeded in liberating nearly every single hostage, destroying the majority of Ugandan Air Force fighter planes stationed at Entebbe, and departing Uganda within 90 minutes. Awakening the following morning, Amin was bewildered and enraged by what had transpired. Amin's involvement in the Palestinian hijacking of the Air France flight during the summer of 1976 constituted merely one instance among a succession of progressively provocative endeavors that he pursued globally during the latter half of the 1970s. By permitting the Israelis to refuel in Nairobi, it was abundantly clear that the Kenyan government had enabled the Israeli mission to liberate their citizens at Entebbe. Undoubtedly, the Kenyan regime found Amin's progressively jingoistic demeanor towards them to be intolerable. In 1902, a significant portion of what is now considered Western Kenya was incorporated into the Ugandan Protectorate by the British. These very lands were ultimately returned to Kenya upon the country's independence so that it could be incorporated. However, during the mid-1970s, Amin started advocating an extensively unfounded assertion that this particular region of Western Kenya belonged to Uganda or was part of a Greater Uganda. Without a doubt, this would have inspired the Nairobi government to assist the Israeli rescue operation in July 1976. However, it did have repercussions, as Amin retaliated against hundreds or thousands of ethnic Kenyans living in Uganda in the weeks that followed the Air France incident. During the mid-1970s, religious leaders in Uganda grew progressively apprehensive regarding the regime's polarizing strategies towards the Christian and Muslim communities in the country. Amin pursued the Muslim populace on purpose while suppressing a number of Christian churches. The Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, Janani Luwum, presided over a conference of Anglican, Catholic, and Muslim leaders in late 1976. Luwum had been particularly vocal about the need to diffuse religious tensions. At this meeting, all participants agreed to work toward bridging religious divisions in the country moving forward. However, upon learning of this, Amin, who had not been apprised of the gathering in advance, had Luwum arrested on false charges of plotting an armed uprising. Then, on February 17, 1977, Luwum was paraded before the international media in an effective manner. The subsequent day, a statement from Amin's regime claimed that the Archbishop had perished in a car accident. However, nobody was duped, and subsequent reports indicate that Amin may have even shot Luwum. Subsequently, the Archbishop received the adoration of a martyr. Further evidence of Amin's regime's instability and isolation was the absence of an invitation for him to attend a meeting of the Commonwealth States' heads of state shortly thereafter. The behavior exhibited by Luwum and the other religious leaders served as an illustration of the growing opposition towards Amin's regime among senior figures in Uganda. This permeated the ranks of his administration as well. During a visit to London in 1975, Emmanuel Blayo Wakwaya, the finance minister of Amin, defected to Britain. However, an even more detrimental development was the defection of Henry Kayemba, the health minister, in 1977. Kayemba expeditiously composed an internal account of the Amin regime and released it under the title A State of Blood, which was a scathing denunciation of Amin's heinousness and bloodshed. Despite the fact that the international community held Amin and his regime in contempt, which severely impeded his ability to govern Uganda, it was unable to depose him. Amin maintained a secure position so long as he maintained strict control over the military and government within the country. But this ceased to be the case as time passed. Late in 1977, factions emerged within the Ugandan military, those who maintained unwavering allegiance to Amin, and those who favored Vice President General Mustafa Adrizi over the increasingly irrational figure that Amin appeared to be. Recognizing Adrizi's increasing power and seeking to consolidate his own authority, Amin engaged in a decisive conflict in 1978 that ultimately led to the downfall of his regime. Relations between Amin's Uganda and the neighboring Tanzania, which was at times hostile, had been tense for years. Milton Obote had established himself in exile at this location in 1971. It was from this location that a portion of his supporters initiated the unsuccessful invasion of Uganda in the autumn of 1972. Thus, by the late 1970s, it had transformed into the catalyst for Amin's ultimate deposition. Towards the end of autumn 1978, Adrizi-aligned troops mutinied in southern Uganda, close to the Tanzanian border. Amin chose to effectively escalate the conflict with Tanzania from the outbreak of fighting in Uganda, a move that would strengthen his position within the country and enable him to consolidate his authority. Upon realizing that he had lost control of certain army elements along the southern border and desired to subsequently take credit for their incursions into Tanzanian territory, he may have made this decision hastily. Undoubtedly, Amin benefited from the initial phases of the Uganda-Tanzania War. During the early winter season, Ugandan forces amassed substantial forces in northern Tanzania and occupied the area to the extent that Amin could declare his intention to annex the Kagera region of northern Tanzania as 1978 came to a close. Nevertheless, everything would abruptly alter in 1979. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere initiated the mobilization of the Tanzanian People's Defense Force in January 1979 with the intention of launching a retaliatory offensive against Amin's armies in the north. They were accompanied by a substantial group of Ugandans in exile in Tanzania who had expressed opposition to the Amin regime. As Amin's forces advanced north, they encountered setbacks and were ultimately defeated in certain areas. Certain units fled into the Congo via the western border. The majority was progressively compelled to retreat towards Kampala as the winter of 1979 gave way to spring. At this time, Gaddafi in Libya and the Palestinian Liberation Organization provided him with minimal support, whereas Saudi Arabia and Saddam Hussein's Iraq offered him desperate requests for foreign assistance. The pivotal conflict of the war transpired on March 10 and 11 at the Battle of Lukaya, situated to the southwest of Kampala. An army comprised of 1,000 Libyans and 2,000 Ugandan troops, bolstered by 18 tanks, was defeated at this location by an exile force composed of Tanzanian and Ugandan forces, which lacked tank support but possessed vastly superior infantry. As the news of the defeat spread throughout Kampala in the hours that followed, numerous individuals urged Amin to concede to the circumstances and resign as Uganda's leader. Until the very end, Amin remained defiant in Kampala. Despite the approach of Ugandan and Tanzanian exile forces towards Entebbe Airport, situated to the southwest of the capital along the shores of Lake Victoria, he exhibited unwavering determination and even terminated his military chief of staff, Yusuf Gowon. Nevertheless, as the opposition approached the capital and his supporters dwindled, Idi Amin did manage to escape from Kampala via helicopter on April 11, 1979. This date is widely regarded as the official conclusion of his regime in Uganda. In the months that followed, however, Uganda did not immediately regain its peace. A loose civilian government comprised of numerous interest groups was established. However, it proved to be ineffective and experienced significant divisions. Ultimately, a subsequent military coup transpired in May 1980. This would result in a military government for a brief period of time. However, in contrast to Amin in 1971, Paulo Mwanga, the interim military governor, successfully orchestrated elections and facilitated the transition to civilian rule by the conclusion of 1980. Among these was the re-election of Milton Obote as the new president of Uganda. However, opposition met Milton Obote's re-establishment as leader in the 1980 elections. Numerous factions held the belief, possibly not without considerable merit, that the electoral process had been manipulated to benefit Obote's Uganda People's Congress. Consequently, upon assuming office for a second term as president, Obote initiated a guerrilla war in Uganda against those who opposed his government's legitimacy. Over 5 years would pass during the alleged Ugandan Bush War, which was fought between Obote's government and guerrillas led by Yoweri Museveni. In 1985, as Museveni and his supporters ultimately gained the upper hand, Obote departed from Uganda. Subsequently, in January 1986, guerrilla forces stormed into Kampala, and Museveni, who had fled to Tanzania in 1971 when he was 21 years old, assumed office as the new president of Uganda. Uganda was not experiencing a new dawn with the ascension of Museveni and his national resistance movement to power in Kampala. Having been re-elected in January 2021, Museveni is one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, having never been removed from office. Political affairs in Uganda have been plagued by violations of human rights and persecution of minority groups ever since. However, this Ugandan Bush War transpired during the 1980s and Idi Amin was not involved. His influence over the violence was predominantly limited to the 1970s. The precise number of deaths attributable to Amin's regime is difficult to ascertain due to Uganda's ill-defined population at the time. which made it difficult to calculate the death toll from censuses and other statistical data, and the fact that the killings and disappearances that claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people were not officially recorded by their very nature. In addition, determining what to count is frequently challenging. Thousands perished in Uganda, for example, throughout these years, not due to a directive from the government but rather as an indirect consequence of Amin's establishment of a military state where senior army personnel could commit murder without repercussions. Similarly, the economy's mismanagement contributed to the fatality toll, albeit through indirect channels. Notwithstanding these constraints, it is currently acknowledged in the field, on the basis of Amnesty International's assertions, that Amin's regime murdered a minimum of 300,000 individuals from 1971 to 1979. However, census data provides some support for a population decline ranging from 420,000 to 800,000. Although a precise tally may be unattainable, it is indisputable that Amin's regime in Uganda inflicted severe suffering on the populace throughout the 1970s. It was, without a doubt, one of the most brutal dictatorships that the continent witnessed at the time. After boarding the flight from Kampala, Amin refrained from departing Uganda immediately. He was unapprehended in the eastern region of the country for several weeks and even attempted to establish an opposition government whose capital would be Jinja, situated on Lake Victoria. However, he swiftly confronted reality and fled the country entirely, initially making his way to Libya, where he was granted temporary refuge by his former ally Gaddafi. In 1980, he relocated to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where the government granted him official sanctuary. This was his second eastward move. He gave his first post-rule interview shortly after his arrival, in which he defended his reign as ruler of Uganda and asserted that many Ugandans desired his reinstatement to power. Notwithstanding these claims, Amin never regained power or assumed a significant political role again. However, in 1989, he made an attempt to return to Uganda by flying to Zaire, where a major conflict had erupted, which had far-reaching consequences for several neighboring countries, including Uganda. Amin had hoped to establish a support network in this location in preparation for his return to Uganda, which had been engulfed in its own chaos since the late 1980s. The mission proved to be unsuccessful, and Amin returned to Saudi Arabia within months. The United States and others had coerced a hesitant Saudi government into accepting him back. Amin spent the remaining years of his life in Saudi Arabia, refraining from any further attempts to intervene in Uganda. He was also cautioned sternly against participating in television interviews or addressing the media. During his later years, he maintained a relatively close relationship with his villa in Jeddah. He attended massage parlors, sports events, and shopping excursions in his Range Rover or Chevrolet Caprice. Additionally, he frequently visited the airport, where Amin was required to clear packages of Ugandan goods through customs. Subsequent to the whiskey runs from Stansted Airport to Kampala in the 1970s, which transported luxury goods by airplane, parcels containing cassava and other East African cuisine began to arrive in Jeddah during the 1990s. Surprisingly, demands for Amin's prosecution in an international court for his war crimes were minimal throughout this period. In the summer of 2003, the former dictator was either 80 years old or very close to that age when his family received word that he was in a coma at a Jeddah hospital due to kidney failure. The response to his family's request that he be permitted to return to Uganda to die was that he would face prosecution if he entered the country. As a result, on August 16, 2003, when life support was withdrawn in Jeddah, Amin passed away and was interred in a relatively unremarkable grave in the capital of Saudi Arabia. Idi Amin undoubtedly governed with brutality as a dictator. His regime implemented widespread political oppression from its inception and further exacerbated religious and ethnic divisions in Uganda as a means of dividing the populace and exerting control over them, as opposed to striving to unite the diverse factions of Ugandan society in the aftermath of independence in order to create a strong Uganda. Under the leadership of a progressively unstable individual, potentially afflicted with a form of dementia caused by syphilis and with a history of immorality and excessive violence. Significant segments of the populace were subjected to oppression during the 1970s. The precise number of fatalities attributable to the regime remains uncertain. However, a prudent approximation would place the number at least 300,000, with the regime's egregious economic mismanagement contributing to the further destitution of millions more. Subsequently, as the dictatorship encountered mounting disapproval, even from factions that Amin had explicitly courted as allies, it attempted to instigate regional conflicts with neighboring countries as a means to bolster domestic support. However, this approach proved to be ineffective, as the conflict with Tanzania in 1978 swiftly resulted in Amin's removal and subsequent exile the following year. Thus, the 8-year rule of one of the most ruthless dictators in Africa came to a close. However, the manner in which Amin rose to power also stands as a poignant reminder of the shortcomings that plagued the decolonization of Africa during the 1950s and 1960s. Through British training, Amin ascended to prominence as a member of the King's African Rifles. On the eve of Uganda's independence, when he was accountable for a significant atrocity against civilians, a decision was made not to go to court-martial but rather to conceal the incident politically, as it was not considered prudent to prosecute him at that moment. Perhaps his regime could have been averted had he been present. In 1971, subsequent to this, the British and Israeli governments extended their support to him in his endeavor to usurp Milton Obote's authority, motivated by their individual geopolitical objectives. During the post-independence era in Africa, nations on both sides of the Cold War supported the rise and rule of autocratic regimes such as Amin and Joseph Mobutu in the neighboring Congo or Zaire due to such narrow self-interested concerns. However, those who supported Amin's ascent in 1971 had no idea the consequences that would follow. A dictator and his adherents were accountable for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ugandans, the displacement of a great number of others, and the destabilization of the entire East African region between 1971 and 1979. Regrettably, following his ousting from power in 1979, Amin was able to reside without constraint in exile and evade international prosecution. What is your assessment of Idi Amin? Did he emerge as one of the most ruthless dictators on the African continent during the era of repressive regimes that ensued after independence in the 1960s and 1970s? Kindly provide your feedback in the comment section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.